Welcome to our monthly Dalim Tips and Tricks webinar. My name is Mike Moscato from Blanchard, and today we're going to go over working with trigger sets in ES5. And we'll do, first of all, remind you, as we always do, that if you've got the GoToWebinar app up and running and you need it to be bigger or fit on your screen, you should have a little button up in the top left there where you can scale it to fit. So with that, let's get going. First thing I should mention is if you're running ES4.5 and you start looking for trigger sets, you should stop looking because you won't find them. Trigger sets are ES5 feature only. If you do have ES5, you'll find them under the workflows creation section. What we're going to work with and what you will hopefully discover today is some of the basics of how triggers work. The bottom line is that triggers are basically actions that get started or get run when something happens to a certain type of source object. Those source objects could be a project, documents, folders, sections, that kind of stuff. And the other thing is that these things will almost always, unless you decide to configure things a little differently, kind of occur outside of your normal project and document workflows. What we'll also see is that most of the useful triggers that you're going to play with, I'm going to guess, are going to be based on metadata changes, where a change of one or several metadata values will then cause either other metadata get changed or fire off user actions, or actually it could do both if you chose to. I think typically you'll see a lot of this with user actions, but we'll try to cover a fair variety of those things today. So let's get out of Keynote and let's jump over into ES. Before I run over this first quick example I'm going to do, the one thing that I want to mention is that a lot of the things you see happen here in terms of, how we manipulate files and so forth, are things that you already do in ES. So, I'm not going to pull a new rabbit out of my hat, but what we are going to do is when we pull the rabbit out of the hat, we're going to use different tricks to do it than what we're used to doing. We're going to start here with this real simple job. Notice there's no project workflow associated with it. And as I'll show you in a bit, the document workflow is about as simple as they come. So I'm going to go into this job ticket. And I've got this kind of simplistic panel that I've got in here. You could be more complicated, but for the sake of the webinar, I've got it pretty simple. And I'm going to enter in a single value for this code. What you're going to see happen is after I enter it in there, ES is going to auto-populate the rest of those fields for me. The student fire off any project workflows or anything like that. Now let's say, you know what, that's the wrong code. I should have put the BSI code in there. If I put that in here, you're going to see it load in a completely different set of values into our panel. That is an example of a trigger set. And in a little bit, we'll actually go in and see how do you put something like that together. But let's continue in this project. I'm going to do something else that is fairly common. Most of you have probably done this sort of thing before. I'm going to pick a couple files to upload. And if you look at my upload panel, I got a simple option here, create hard proof. We know what that usually does. It'll create a variable or a hunk of metadata, and within your workflow, it'll probably go to an eTwist workflow or get routed to something like that to generate the proof. And if we look over here on the side, we see, indeed, couple files got sent out here for proof. Obviously, I don't have a proofer here, but we're just making believe this is like sending it to a hot folder. But if we look at the workflow, I ran that through. You can see that's a pretty, this is like the Wiffle dialog workflow with a couple other things in it. And the only thing that happened here was that I captured that piece of metadata. Remember, file bag is what you get when you upload. And I just wrote that to another piece of metadata. That's all I did. So there's no eTwist workflow in here, no ESConnect, and somehow these proof files showed up in here. So let's go look at some basic trigger settings and kind of figure out how we did that and other things like it. If we go over to your workflow section in ES, this is where you create trigger sets. Now, a trigger set could be a couple different triggers, maybe only one, or maybe you're doing a webinar and you got just a whole bucket full of these things. And what we're going to start with is a couple of the real basic ones that, frankly, I think are of little utility, but I think are useful to show you how to put these things together. We're going to start out with this one that we made already. First thing you'll notice when you create one of these is you have to define an event type. You'll see there's 3 of them. 2 of them that are these pre-baked things are document placed, which means you put a file on the flat plan. Document moved out of flat plan, you pulled it out. Frankly, I'm not sure there's a whole lot of usefulness for those, but I'm going to use those as examples of how to get this triggers to do things, and then we'll move on to something that's maybe a little more interesting. So what I'm saying is, if I throw a file on the flat plan, something's going to happen. That something is the action. Now, all I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I want to set a piece of metadata, and notice this scope setting. This basically says, well, where are you going to do it, or what are you going to do it to? Well, I'm going to do it to a document. So if I drag it into flat plan, I'm going to set a piece of metadata called isPlaced and set it to true. That's pretty darn simple. And, you know, I think for the most part, pretty useless. But well, let's just watch this thing go through the paces. And I'm using this other one, this guy, if it comes out of the flat plan. I mean, this is really crazy stuff. I mean, who would think of this? If I pull it out, I'm going to set this isPlaced value to false. So really, we're defining metadata by simply moving things around. I'm not even sure which job this is. Let's see. I know I got a job somewhere with this. Here we go. So first, just so you can see, this metadata for this document doesn't have any of that stuff. I'm just going to drag it in a flat plan. What happened? Metadata got updated for the document. I guess that's kind of interesting. And next, though, I'm going to take that file and drag it out of the flat plan. The isPlaced value is set to false. Okay, that's it. Pretty much the same thing that happened when we dragged it in. But you're also going to see now the file disappeared. So what we just did then is we used a trigger to trigger another trigger. So you can actually kind of daisy chain these things. Because what we did here is we know if we drag it out, it sets that thing to false. But I got another trigger right here. And it says, if a document has this isPlaced hunk of metadata, if it gets set to false, then I want to run a user action. And you'll notice I waited 10 seconds because I had to blab some more. You know, I just can't get enough talking on these things. But after 10 seconds, scope is document. It's going to affect the document. It's going to run a user action. It's a pretty simple user action. It deletes files. I'm going to show one more example of this event type that we call, move to flat plan. And this one is right out of the manual. In fact, from what I've seen, it's about the only example I've seen from Dalim so far on things to do with these things. What this one does is if you drag a file into the flat plan, notice how it changed the name of the file. It appended the folio. And you probably can't see it, but it also put the version that it's on. Let's move it over to page 5. It's going to change the name again. Again, based on the folio, it's page 5. Let's drag it to slot 2. 3 different versions. We'll go to the newsstand version for that file. And if you look here, it's now newsstand NS2 because it goes by the folio name. So again, what we're seeing is, in this case, a trigger event runs a user action. The user action has, as you can probably guess, a program link in it to manipulate the file name and change it. But what I'll show you now is one of the more, it's probably the first gotcha that you'll run into with trigger sets, unless you pay close attention. Here's a file. I'm just going to do that silly stuff again. I'm going to drag it into the flat plan. Did the name change? No, it didn't. Did the metadata get updated on it? No, it didn't. So we have to ask ourselves, why didn't it do anything? And of course, the other thing you would perhaps have to ask is, when I dragged these things into the flat plan, it didn't do any metadata change, it just changed the name. The reason we see these differences is that trigger sets have to be associated with the project template that you're working with. If you don't assign the trigger set to your project template, you can beat your head against the wall all day long and they won't do anything. So for instance, that first thing that we worked with, this has the trigger set webinar, the one that had the big long list we saw earlier. The one we just ran that kind of changed the name of the file when it goes into flat plan, it ran a completely different trigger set. So that's why for the one it changed the name, and for the other it went through the file renaming when we played with it. Oh, I got to close my email. I don't know why I get that open. Okay. So let's go back to trigger set land. And let me make sure I get into the right job here. Yeah. Now, this is something I've been playing around with that I think it would be useful if Dalim could create maybe an extra panel off to the side here that has basically just a list of all available trigger sets. Because watch what I'm going to do here. Let's say I want to very quickly lock all the pages in the flat plan. So you see what I have here is I've got my own little trigger panel. I want to lock everything in a flat plan. This is a trigger set where the source is project and the scope is document. Okay? Let's go a little further. Let's say I want to make a digital edition out of these guys. Now, one of the interesting things about when you're working with a project trigger and the scope is document is it will basically get every file that's in the project for me. So if I take a look-see over here at eTwist, which looks as, we know how reliable eTwist is. I suspect those files ran. Let's see. Yep. And there's my digital edition that just came out of here, okay? Now here's something that's kind of interesting though. Let's say we realize, that digital edition I just did is wrong. Now we know that normally the way we do stuff like this is in the project workflow, we may have a send event. And in the document workflow, there may be a wait event that basically releases all these things go to eTwist. There's nothing like that in here. There's no send wait events happening at all. Now, what I want to do is I want to unlock a page. Now, I've played around with a unlock all option in here, but I haven't any luck with it so far. But let's say we decided, that this page should have been over here. They're in the wrong spot. I'm going to flip them. Now, again, normally as workflow would send wait events, you'd probably have to back these things up to run it again. I don't have to do that. I'm just going to go here and tell it to make another digital edition for me. And off it goes. And our little finder window over here on the right, I think should hopefully update, and it just did. Here's one thing to note. You saw me earlier select that send to digital edition guy. When I came back to do it the second time, though, you may have noticed it was no longer selected, and it should probably not be selected. Yeah, he's still waiting. There he is. Notice he's deselected now. Now, what I found it can be useful when you're using these kind of Boolean buttons is if you click it and get it to do something, it'll do it. But it would be kind of silly if you wanted to do it again to have to deselect it and then select it again. So what I've done with a lot of these is I've got this kind of extra trigger action going on that basically resets the buttons for me. For instance, the one we just did, make digital edition, right? How's this guy work? We're working with metadata. If the project, metadata set project information has this make digital edition metadata set to true, scope, all documents, don't delay, run this merge action that I got. Fair enough. But then after he runs, I got another trigger to reset that for me. What's he do? He says if you set that thing to true, which we did to make the digital edition, then wait 30 seconds and set that piece of metadata then to false. So that's how we can very quickly reset these buttons if we want to use them again. A couple others real quick. You may have seen in the panel here. If I want to archive all these things, I just had that release to archive. If you were on the webinar a couple months ago, we went over archiving. Normally, the way we were doing that is, I'm not sure, we might have done that with triggers or with send wait events, but you can see here, we can just run it with a click of a button and archive that whole job. Again, there's nothing in the workflow that tells it to run the archive. In this case, what we're doing is if metadata for the project, I have this goofy thing I call go archive, go do it. If it's set to true, I got a user action that will archive every document that's in that there project. Now, one thing that, in certain respects, you can say to yourself, well, you took the time to go and click that and do something. You could just as easily click a file and go run a user action, and I think there's some truth to that. So a lot of times, I think it would be preferable to be able to just have the triggers get triggered when things just run through a workflow through their normal course of events. This guy, for instance, this is a workflow, a project workflow. We'll take a quick look at it, in which we've hit, once a job is complete and done, it hits a milestone that's going to be held. Now, that milestone, is set so that after, I think I set it for after 30 days, it will be completed, and then this job will continue. What's going to happen when it continues? It's going to run it's going to set a piece of metadata, and that's that piece of metadata we were just talking about. It's going to set the metadata, this go archive thing, to true, and we know, based on trigger logic, if that thing changes, and we'll make believe the 30 days is up and it continues. There's no send wait events. There's no, oops. Okay, that got screwed up because I was editing the workflow. All right, let's do it again. We're setting a hunk of metadata. It's going to fire the trigger. And now you're going to see everything start archiving again. If you haven't played with the archiving, those little funky orange dots up there mean that the archive is going, and the other one we worked with just a second ago, if you ever see the green dots, that means it completed. Now, all of these required that the files either move through the workflow, set a hunk of metadata, and fire a trigger, or have us, actually click a button, set some metadata, and have a trigger get fired. Where the triggers can really be kind of useful and speed things up, I think, is when you're working with smart views. Now, I'm going to go to the file system here. And I've got a couple folders full of files, full of images. What I want to do is I want to go through and very quickly rate these files. But in addition to rating them, I want ES to then just sort them out for me automatically. For instance, let's say, okay, this one is a 3. Let's say that one is a 2. And if you've played with these before, you've noticed how you'll see the little ranking thing change on the file. But you'll also notice those 2 files just disappeared. The 2 went into a folder called marginal, and the 3 went into one that I just called further review. Now, let's say we look at this one and say, that one is just ain't cut. I'm going to rate him as a 1. This is set up so that all 1-star files are just going to get deleted and go away. So, although we're kind of sitting here waiting for it to do stuff, you don't have to do that. If you want to just rate these things and get them to go real quick, let's give this guy, he's a 5, 5, 4, 2, a 1. Let's see, a 3, a 4. You get the idea. 5. So if you look in the keepers folder, this thing looks like it's taking a while to get caught up with us. In fact, I have seen this before where it sometimes kind of get backed up. Let's see. No, it's still not moving for us. We'll just try one more here. Let's make him a 4. Because we saw these guys worked for us. I suspect something is just backed up, so we're not going to spend all day on that.
It just showed logic to it, Mike.
Yeah, we'll at least go through the logic that we've got there. Let's see, I got to find it. I got so many things in here. Rating to folder. This is the trigger set. Now, you saw the examples I did earlier that I basically just had one rule in here, but you can have multiple rules. This is an OR that we're working. So if my application rating is a 3 or a 2 or a 4 or a 5, and you need to run through this user action that I called rating the folder. And the user action itself has the logic to set the folder step up so it puts it in the appropriate folder. There's basically a program link in there. The 1 I have as a separate action, because if you set it to a 1, I'm running a completely different user action, which is delete it. We don't want these 1s hanging around at all. Now, hopefully, this isn't going to gum up the rest of my things, because one of the things that you may or may not be familiar with when working with Smart Views is the macros feature. Macros, usually you'll see the ratings defined as macros, but you can put your other ones in here so that you basically have just quick keyboard commands that are going to set a metadata value. Well, we already know that trigger sets like to see metadata change, so the way these things would work for us is if I just hit the letter P, I'm going to make a proof. If I hit a Control S, it's going to do a send to, and in this case, that just means I'm going to FTP a file. So let's see if our triggers want to behave for us right now. I'm going to go back into, and we'll go into this folder. So for instance, I'm just going to, obviously you can't see me do it, but I just hit the letter P on that file. See if a proof shows up over here. So you should never trust that the stuff's going to work for you during a demo. Let's just take a very quick look at our event log. Could be that there's something gumming up the works. If you haven't seen this in ES5, ES5 has this separate user action monitoring option now. Well, actually, those things look to me like they've been moving through. At least they started the rating workflow. You can see here, this is the action rating workflow that we were running. Oh, those are the first 3 we did. Okay. Now, there's actually something stuck here. So we'll just continue on and just look at some of the logic to build these things. For instance, that thing, this proofing thing, is kind of a variation on the same theme we've been looking at. This is one where a metadata value for a document changes this value, again, I'd set it to true, and it fires it off to a user action to proof. You know, this is really ticking me off, but let's look at, let's see, what else should we look at? Yeah, here's another one. Although I'm sure this isn't going to work either, but I'll show you anyways. You may have noticed that when we define our scope, document project, but you also have one of the options is folder. And what this one would do is if I tell it that I'm going to change a metadata value associated with a folder, I then want it to be applied to every document that's in that folder. This was another proofing one that I was playing with, so that if I change, and if you've never done it, you can actually create job tickets that are folder job tickets. So for instance, this is the job ticket created with that folder, and if this thing wanted to play nice with me, clicking that would then fire those files off. And you know, it's annoying enough that I'm going to restart Tomcat on that machine because we have to see this thing work properly. And this will just take a second. It's everybody's favorite routine when ES doesn't want to play nice.
We'll capture a couple of questions that are out there right now while Mike's waiting on the restart.
Okay.
The first question we got, of course, is always, is this a separate module or separately licensed feature? It's part of ES Core. However, it's pretty much not useful unless you have enterprise project tracking and maybe the, excuse me, the job ticket option. So it is part of the, with those packages, you have full use of everything Mike is showing right now. The other question is whether they're exportable / importable. And yes, they are. You can select them, export them, and import them into a different ES server.
Gee, I didn't know that one.
Which one, the second one?
Yeah. Notice that my proofs just showed up that I tried. So, yeah, I think this is going to clean out whatever was gummed up there, which is good. In fact, if that guy got through, I believe it'll clear the ones that were in front of him. So let's see if our folder management got managed. Joshua Tree, I think that's where we were. Yep. Now, here's kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind here, though. If we're thinking about this as a way to, kind of sort out our images, here's the marginal 2-star guys. Here's the 3s and 4s. Maybe you want to think about them later, right? But we'll assume that the 5s are good to go. And if we look at the files that went to this keepers folder, notice they started up on a completely separate workflow. This is, this is just a phony baloney thing I put together, but you could think of this as a way to very quickly get this into your image approval workflow. And the way you do it is folders can have their own workflows and properties assigned to them. So the keepers folder has a specific image workflow assigned to them. So anything that we give a 5-star automatically goes to the folder, and the folder automatically starts running it through the. So here's me befuddled. We know that's normal, but let's do a 1 and see if we can get this guy to delete the way he's supposed to. There he goes.
That's what
everyone knows.
Is that what you just looked like when you were trying to get the triggers to start working?
Exactly. Yep. In fact, this is the other one I was trying to show just a second ago. If you want to make like I said, if you're dealing with these macros, let's say I wanted to run this through the proofing thing, right? If I hit a P on that, that's going to fire the proofing trigger, and you see it just showed up there. That's the proof guy. And real quick, because I think this one's an interesting one as well, was the ability to take an entire folder and just go here, create hard proof. I probably should have titled it create hard proof for everything in folder, because that's what it's going to do. And you'll see those guys are showing up over here off to the right. So that just fired a whole folder full of stuff. There's a couple others real quick I want to show. The first thing I should show is how I did that first thing that we were working on. Excuse me. This is the one where we set that project metadata. This is an OR statement as well. I got a metadata value called my code. If it's XYZ or if it's BSI, I got a whole panel for the values that it's going to fill in. Scope is project, because it's the job ticket for a project, and set that information. But here's one. I think that's not the right one. Oh yeah, this is one I want to show. When you set up your little rules here, you're basically, the rules are, if this metadata value, for everything I think I've shown you, I've said if it equals something. But and frankly, I didn't even notice this till last night. There's this matches option as well. The matches is really a pattern, or more like a regular expression. So if my code equals just 3 digits, it's going to set up something completely different. So if we go back to one of those goofy jobs I got, if I just pop in 777, that's going to match that pattern. Now it's going to load in everything associated with that job. One final thing to show you, and I think, yeah, it's this one. You can also set up, and this is a kind of a simplistic one, but you can have a pretty long string of different conditionals in here. This one is an OR with a couple of AND statements. So what I'm basically saying is if we match this and this, we will fire an action, or if we match this and this. So this first rule, we'll play with that one. What we're saying is if we're delivering to the mom and pop's printer and Jude is the contact, we're going to, again, just for the sake of this example, we're going to change a different hunk of metadata. We're going to say the secondary contact is Billy Bob, right? So again, what we're doing is saying if that and that are matched, it should fire a trigger and change one specific value, which it did. Now, the key is that both of those have to change. I think what you'll sometimes see when you're playing around with these, especially if you've got some of these ands and ors, you have to make sure that the things actually change. Because if you have a value that's set and it's just sitting there as a static value, the triggers, as per their name, only get triggered when something happens or something changes. So in that case, if him and him change, then do that. And if I go here and I completely change my code there, whatever it was, 777, it fires again because we changed that value, and again loads in the presets for that. That's probably all we should cover now, but I do want to go back to the one gotcha I mentioned earlier, because this is the most common one to trip you up. Make sure that the project template you're working with has the trigger set assigned to it that you want to use. And one of the things that's, frankly, I think a bit confusing is if you create a project and you look at it, it doesn't show the trigger set in here. The only time you'll know for sure if the trigger set is assigned to the appropriate project template is you got to go all the way back here to your template setup within your customer and confirm there, yes, this is the appropriate trigger set that I want to use for this guy. So that is one to keep upmost in your mind when you start playing around with these. And I tend to think when you start using these, you should start small and get a feel for how they work and how they interact. And once you know that, I think you can then start maybe building more complex things. I tend to think that once some of the clever customers we have out there get their hands on these, they're going to do some pretty nice things with them. And I forgot one last thing I should mention, because this was something I was trying to get to work in one of mine, and for the life of me, I couldn't get it to behave. And I must have deleted it, but I'll just show you right here. one of the things you can do with these, because you saw these actions are, a user action or change some metadata, but you can also fire a script. So if you have some clever scripts you're going to run, and I believe you should probably be able to maybe call the API from there. You can trigger scripts from here as well. And I'm not sure if we can do exactly the same thing we could do with a script step in ES, but it might be an interesting path to explore.
Yeah, with script steps we could call through a user action driven workflow.
Yeah.
But I think Gautier had mentioned that the API was not accessible this way, but I'm not sure that. We'd have to check on that.
Another thing you'll notice here in the scope, if you look at these three bottom options, these were just added recently. And what these are supposed to do is, in ES5, there is the link feature in which you may have an InDesign document, and then it will show all of the linked elements associated with it. So the logic of these would appear to be that you could call a specific hunk of metadata, perhaps here, and fire it to actually grab the links associated with a parent document. But I have to say, in all the tests I've done so far, this does not work. I'm trying to get going.
I did play with that a little bit at a customer site, and what I was able to do was actually trigger. So every document that a specific file was placed on to the relationship stuff, I was able to change the metadata for those documents. So,
no, I'd like to see that because I was pulling my hair, well, what little I have, trying to get this thing to behave. The most I could get it to do was to actually grab what I consider to be the parent document and do something with it. But to me, that seemed totally backwards from what it should be doing.
right,
And the terminology here
is any file that it's placed on, and target link, I believe, is any file that's placed in it. But obviously, you have to have the relationships existing.
Right. Well, that would be a good one to explore because I spent too much time on it and did not get it to behave. Otherwise, I was kind of eager to show that. Any more questions, Fred?
I think you actually covered the questions in that last little bit because we had a question about exactly that, the relationship stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And also we did have somebody ask again if you could go back through the triggers assigned to the project, which you did. They also did ask, though, that, let's see, is this required if you're using triggers in a document or form workflow for the project? So, yeah, if they're used anywhere in that project, that trigger set needs to be applied.
Yep.
And I think another one just came in. If I can get my mouse to behave now. There we go.
Yeah, I didn't really think there was enough time to go all the way over messing with sections and versions and all that kind of stuff.
But yeah, you can apply to all of that, but it does have to be applied to the project that way, the project template. Then we got ES scripts, shell scripts, or Java. Tickle. What kind of language are you typing in there?
In these guys, that is a normal ES script, like if you do that context.get metadata thing. But I'm trying to think. There is, oh yeah, down here you can run JavaScript on the source or trigger definition. This is one I haven't played with as yet. And I've the latest documentation or manual shows nothing to give you some guidance on how to utilize this.
Right, and I think that covers the questions.
Okay. as you know, I think it's the third Wednesday of every month, do the tips and tricks.
That's correct.
So sometime in March. I'm not sure what the day is.
Right. Again, if y'all have ideas for any topics you'd like to see us cover in these webinars, please just shoot them over to text@blanchard.com and we'll be happy to consider them. So everybody, thank you for your attention today. Hope this was helpful. And you'll get a link to the video that'll be put out tomorrow about the same time. Thanks a lot, guys.